Well, good afternoon or good morning, wherever people are. I want to welcome you to this ITIF event on how America can compete with China. I'm Rob Atkinson. I'm the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. We're really happy to host this event today. And we're going to mostly hear from, at the beginning, from my colleague, David Moschella, who we co-authored this paper that's on our website, although I have to say David did the lion's share of the inspiration in the work, so it's really to his credit. David is a research fellow at the Leading Edge Forum, where he explores the global business impact of digital technologies, and with a particular focus on disruptive business models, industry restructuring, and machine intelligence. Prior to that, he was in charge of worldwide research for IDC, the largest market analysis firm in the IT industry. Jim McGregor is the Greater China Chairman for APCO Worldwide, where he serves as a senior advisor on China business, political, and communication strategies. He's the author of two really excellent books I encourage you to read, No Ancient Wisdom, No Followers, The Challenges of Chinese Authoritarian Capitalism, and 1 Billion Customers, Lessons from the Front Lines on Doing Business in China. He's lived in China for over 30 years, and he actually had one of the very earliest reports on Chinese mercantilism, if you will. It was really a kind of a seminal report that certainly got me focused on this whole question of how to deal with China and what they're doing with regard to technology. And lastly, my colleague Craig Allen, who's the president of the U.S.-China Business Council, which represents over 200 American companies doing business with China. Prior to USCBC, Craig had been in a distinguished long career in public service. He had been at the Commerce Department leading China efforts there, and most recently was U.S. Ambassador to Brunei Darussalam. So welcome, everybody. And let me just make a couple of kind of quick points about this issue. We've kind of evolved from this position on China where everything was yes. Yes, China was going to reform. Yes, they were becoming more democratic. Yes, we should be more engaged. Almost the opposite. China doesn't appear they're going to reform, and much of the answer coming out of Washington is no. No more Chinese students, no more investment, no more exports. And I think that the no position is equally as bad or as problematic as the reflexive yes position. We have to figure out a way to live with China. We're going to have to live with them for a long time as a major power, a major competitor, a major customer, a major supplier, as David goes through in his piece. So we're going to have to figure out what that means. And then sort of while the emotional responses they feel good, they're not going to get us where we need to go. And that's really what we want to explore today. So with that, I want to turn it over to David. David, you want to kick us off?
Sure, and thanks, Rob, and hello, everybody. Greetings here from Gloucester, Massachusetts, and thanks for tuning in. As Rob sort of said in his kind introduction, it sort of hinted at it anyways, I'm not really a China expert or a China watcher in any sense. I tend to look at how digital technologies are changing business and society, and I have a particular focus on so-called disruptive technology and what it is that tends to shake up industries and why. And over the last bunch of years, I've sort of built an industry database of, if you look at sort of standard industrial groupings, the 15 or so that most people would tend to use, and you try to figure out, well, what's most likely to shake up that industry? China, climate change, AI, technology in general, whatever it is. And you sort of do all that and itemize it. And then you start to look. And when we did that, it was very clear that the number of potential scenarios for Chinese disruptions were many, but they were also in virtually every industry sector that we looked at. And that was pretty different than the way a lot of people tend to think about China today, which is sort of a manufacturing side. So we started to think about a way of how do we integrate a China narrative around this disruptive thing. And that's really what I want to talk to you about today. And when we do that sort of work and that sort of thinking, we like to try to basically have some sort of overall framework or model as a way of sort of simplifying things and giving us a consistent way of looking at the world and tracking it over time. And that's what you see here in the figure, and hopefully everybody can see it. And that is that the challenge from China is in many ways uniquely multidimensional. That China is clearly, it's close to the U.S. in terms of market size today, and clearly will be bigger over time. And if it isn't already, it's the biggest supplier with 20% of manufacturing. It's the toughest competitor at Silicon Valley and in many other sectors. And of course, it's a geopolitical rival in South China Sea or around the world in the Mideast, Africa, Belt and Road, South America, whatever you want to look at, all those that we all know. And what's interesting about that to start is that people often say, well, this is a challenge like we've had in the past, but the fact is it isn't. And if you look at the two big ones that we've had from the old USSR and Japan, you see how different they are. That in the USSR case, well, yeah, they were a military and geopolitical rival, but there were none of the other three. So we were pretty free to take action along any of those other dimensions without any great concerns, blocking technologies or whatever you might want to do. And with Japan was a very big supplier to the West and to America, and it was a very tough competitor in many sectors, but it was neither of the other two. It wasn't a big market for most U.S. firms, and it was actually an ally. And so we could pressure Japan on various dimensions without worrying it spilling over into anything military or even close to that. And so the challenge from China hits on all four of these dimensions, which, curiously enough, are the four dimensions that in many ways America was long dominant in. So you see that the sort of scope and extent of the challenge is greater than the other two, and I think in the end will be a tougher one. And so the model helps us put that overall thing in place, but it also helps us start to see why it's such a tough issue for America and particularly for a lot of American policymakers. And that is, to put it bluntly, where companies and individuals tend to stand on China tends to align with where they sit. And if you walk around the four dimensions, you'll see that. So, if you're like the NBA or Hollywood or, Nike or Starbucks or McDonald's or Walmart, if you see China as a major market, your perspective is, hey, we spent a long time in China trying to build this up. It hasn't been easy. Please don't mess this up for us and don't rock the boat. Similarly, if you're in the retail or healthcare or in many technology sectors, and China is a major supplier, your perspective is probably generally, maybe we probably have gotten a bit too dependent on China, but this is a tough one. We're going to make steps. It's going to take time. So patience is really required. And so you had two groups of people there sort of focusing on the opportunities and gaining from China. And the other two seeing China more as a threat. So if China is your main competitor, say you're in solar panels or batteries or telecom equipment or a bunch of other sectors, and you're going to accuse China, hey, they're stealing our IP, they're paying substandard wages, they're subsidizing people, and you need to do something, and you need to do it quickly. And last, and certainly not least, the whole military geopolitical dimension. Some sort of nice words in the slide, but the bottom line is that that group says, hey, our priorities are more important than the other three. And so it's very difficult, arguably impossible, to develop policies that all four of these groups like or approve of and that help. And so that is the fundamental conundrum. And we can look at that a bit more deeply on the next slide to see sort of how the balance of these four dimensions actually sits and works. And that's what we see here. And what I've done is sort of taken the sort of standard industrial groupings that people would tend to use. And then I've taken a leap of faith and just done a fairly simple binary thing of, in general, sort of yes or no, is China a major market, a major supplier, or a major competitor for that particular industry? And of course, people can easily quibble. These giant sectors have lots of things going on, and you're never going to get a perfect answer. But I think this general pattern is broadly true. And what it says historically, and this is sort of a looking back, far more firms have gained from China than suffered by it thus far. And if you look at that, the ones who see China as mostly a market have by far the biggest number, and they're up there at 10, and even some of the others are starting to see it that way. From a supplier point of view, you see 5, and I think those are generally pretty clear, but lots of industries that are not dependent on China as a supplier and don't really care about that issue. And then the competitive one, you see 4 checked, one of which is government, competing in ideas and models and such things. But the other 3, basically manufacturing, defense, and technology, they're really all the same in a sense. They're all manufacturing in one way or another. So the people threatened by China today are pretty much the manufacturing ones. And by and large, they do far less business than all of the other ones, which is why historically business interests in many ways have maintained the status quo, because more people liked what they were doing there than didn't. And a simple way of looking at what the recent events that the Trump administration has done is, well, they've said, yeah, that's all true, but we're going to actually weigh those competitive dimensions higher than the rest of it, and that's going to be our priority, at least for now, and upcoming elections and all that. But the game has shifted, as Rob said, from one that was yes to all the good things to one that's like, well, no, we're not going to do that anymore because we don't like the way this game is playing. And so that's where it is thus far. And you can ask why it's changed. And you can say, well, it was Trump, or whether it was anger about COVID, whether it was the sort of stark realities of Huawei and 5G, or maybe it's just a lot of other industries seeing that what China is doing in manufacturing is coming to them. And virtually every one of these industries today, as I said in my intro, has a plausible disruption story. So if you look at, say, defense, America's huge investments in aircraft carriers and manned fighter jets and large bases, these things may or may not be so appropriate for a world of swarms and miniaturization and cyber and AI and autonomous systems and all of that. You look at something like banking that you think of as being quite sort of immune to this and sort of national in nature, but you look at China's efforts to provide alternatives to the SWIFT or CHIPS global payment systems, to use its own payment technology. The WeChat, they're often far more advanced than ours, the digital yuan and such things. So even education, where are all the Chinese students going to go if they don't come here? And what will that mean to our schools? So every one of these industries that previously was pretty aloof and really on a short-term benefit world now has a sense that, okay, maybe this is something that's going to affect us fairly soon. If you look at China with its sort of made in China 2025 and some of the things they're doing, you can see that all those patterns are in place. So as Rob said in the beginning, we've changed the game, at least temporarily, to essentially one of confrontation. And really just the rest of my time this morning, just a few minutes, I'll talk at the end about, well, if you're going to have confrontation, you might as well play the game to try to win. But before getting that, just a little bit about sort of some of the downsides of there and sort of the declinist scenario that you can sort of see out there, and that much of the world is sort of paying close attention to at a minimum right now. And that's what we see here. I'm sure many people out there are probably familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model of the 5 stages of grief, which originally was built to talk about the way we all dealt with human death and going through phases of denial, anger, depression, bargaining, acceptance, and so on. And since then, that model has been used to sort of help us talk about all kinds of shocking events in life. And you can argue that that cycle is playing out before our eyes right now, that for a long time we were clearly in denial that China would be more like us, they would democratize, global trade would be good, all of those things. And there was good reasons to think it, but people carried on in that for a long time. Another form of denial is that all of China's success comes from cheating or stealing or human rights violations, all of which happen, but there's a lot more going on than that. And, you know, I think it's fair to say that Joe Biden and many of us that were very part of that process. And so we spent many years in that state. And now we're clearly in a different state, one defined by mostly by anger. And certainly Trump embodies that as much as anyone, people suing China, but really all began with and really boiled over with COVID. So the first two phases, I think, are undeniable that we've gone through. And the next three phases are questions depending on what everybody does. But just to sort of fill out the diagram, talk a little bit about each of the next three and sort of the stakes that are out there. And I think they're pretty clear enough that, you know, if America had to acknowledge that, hey, China actually is bypassing Silicon Valley, and yeah, they can do what they want in Taiwan, and we're really not going to do anything about it, and they're gaining friends or at least partners all around all the world, you know, that would be a pretty big shock to the American psyche to have to admit that. And people often use the analogy, well, it's sort of like Britain losing its empire, but it'd actually be far worse than that. That Britain yielding its empire essentially to us, you know, that's sort of like losing to your older, younger brother. It ain't so bad, but losing to someone who's doing things completely different than you are is a much more shocking reality, and it's sort of, you know, on the table right now, and we'll talk about how to try to avoid that. But if you go through that phase, it's pretty clear how the next phases also might well play out, and this idea of bargaining, of trying to find a new role and coming into trading blocks and regional things, is basically the EU reality of what they've done, of using what they have to get the influence that they can, and admitting that they're no longer playing the primary role in a lot of areas. And, you know, that's a reality that you can certainly imagine. And it's also easy to imagine that, like in Europe, the citizenry in the end comes to accept it, that, you know, people say, hey, maybe life isn't so bad without all these burdens and often the endless wars that have come with them. And so there is a cycle here of Asian dominance and American decline and Western decline that is certainly possible. But all that said, you know, we've been through this before. We went through the denial phase with Japan. Oh, yes, they just make low-end stuff, and they'll, you know, they just copy and all that stuff. We went through the huge anger phase. In fact, from having lived through that time and worked in Japan a lot during those years, I actually think the anger against Japan then was that higher than it is against China today, close anyways, you know, when they were buying Pebble Beach and knocking a lot of American companies literally out of business. And we went through those first two phases, and then things changed. You know, it was, you know, maybe this the formation of Sematech, but the reality of protecting the U.S. tech industries became the reality, and that was sort of the Sputnik moment, and the same way we responded to the Soviet challenge. So, you know, there's in the past two times we've responded to quite similar, but not quite as comprehensive challenges as well. And the question is, you know, can you do it again? And that's really where we are today. And it's really where the model that we develop is sort of most directly applied. And it can be applied in two ways. Here you see it applied at sort of an American national level, but we also use it to apply to a specific company level. What do they do in any of these dimensions and contexts, and how they shape a strategy? But from a national point of view, which is really more the theme today, you know, in each of the four areas, we've listed 5 things, and these 20 steps, I think, if taken effectively, would go a long way to improving the U.S. position. And obviously, I don't have a lot of time to talk about all 20 of them, but I thought I would just maybe highlight one in each of the 4 areas. In terms of the market size, this concept of, hey, you know, yeah, China is the biggest country market, but if you define the market the right way, maybe that doesn't matter so much. And 5G is a great example. If the market is the global market, great. But if the market is, well, China 5G is just restricted, you know, it's not in the U.S., it's not in much of Europe, it's not in Japan, Australia, and other places. Well, all of a sudden the size of the China market doesn't look so big. And there are a lot of things along that line of thinking. You know, similarly with supply chains, you know, all the ones there I think are quite interesting, but we put a lot of emphasis on this concept of requiring transparency. Trump talks all the time about how China is ripping us off with a huge trade deficit. But the reality of the trade deficit isn't that American consumers are buying products from Chinese companies. It's that American consumers are buying products from American companies that happen to be made in China. And a huge part of the China trade deficit is Walmart, it's Nike, it's Apple, it's Dell, and all the things that we know. And yet we don't see that data. It's not visible. It's not reported in any consistent way. And if it was, it might help change the way some companies behave, because the data will put pressure on firms to do things differently. So we put a lot of value on transparency. On the competition side, again, they're all big topics there on the right. But in our own research, we put a lot of emphasis on the potential partnership with India. The reality is China has way more engineers than America has, and will always have more engineers than America has. And our STEM stuff isn't going to solve that problem, even if it got better. But if we work closely with India, that whole equation changes. And when you combine their engineering, their science, their software, the mix is completely different. And so that, from a technology partnership, that one is crucial. And it's also something to just keep in mind as a risk. Right now, China and India don't get along. And thank goodness from our point of view for that, because should the world ever align differently and you had sort of a China manufacturing technology prowess coupled with Indian software and OpenStack and AI and analytical skills, well, that would be an existential threat, at least for Silicon Valley. So having India on the right side of this, from our point of view, is just immensely important. And finally, with all the geopolitical stuff, I'm sure a lot of you know more about this than me, but the one thing I put a lot of stress on here is simply the need to buy time. That China is not without its weaknesses. High among these are its rapidly aging population and things resulting from the single child policies. And it, to me, looks like the peak of China demographically will be in the 2020s. But when you get to the 2030s and 2040s, things might look quite a bit different. And therefore, maintaining leadership and competitiveness during this decade seems particularly crucial. So that's sort of how we use things. And I'll just add with one last comment before I turn it over to Rob, and that is, all of these things are doable. They all make sense. There's actually, I think, a lot of consensus to do them all, but there's real questions whether we actually have the will or the ability to do many or all of them, and particularly in these divided times. So, the bottom line is, it's our internal divisions that make most of this difficult, and those are the things that most need to be overcome, and that's not China's problem, that's ours. With that, I'll turn things back to you, Rob. Thanks, Scott.
Great, thank you, David. Hey, before I turn over to Jim, we'll have comments from Jim and then Craig and then a discussion. If you are watching and you want to participate, if you're watching on itif.org, there's a Q&A form under the video. Please feel free to submit a question in writing. And if you're watching on YouTube, there's a link in the event description, and just click on that and we'll be happy to take your questions or comments. So Jim, over to you.
Well, first off, David and Rob, let me compliment you on your report. It really expanded my thinking on some of these issues. There's a number of things in there that had never occurred to me that are very smart. The way I look at this, I have to quote my friend Jeremy Waterman from the U.S. Chamber, who I've done a lot of work with over the years. He talks about, what do? We got to protect ourselves, invest in ourselves, and then work with allies. And I think your report kind of says that in a much more expansive way. I think Americans feel betrayed right now because all the goodwill that went into China, opening markets and universities and scholarships and helping China build its legal system, etc. I don't think people expected a democracy, but they expected more goodwill coming back, but it was more like, okay, thank you very much, and now we're gonna take over. I think China basically buys its own propaganda line that it's a victim, and the world is trying to, this is all about the world led by the West and America trying to keep China poor, because if they get rich, we get poor. The world's a zero-sum game, on and on. Xi Jinping, when he came into office, he said that it was the catch up and overtake phase. And then at the last party Congress, it was pretty clear that he said China's ready to move to the center of the world stage, and that they were in the overtake phase, and we should take that very seriously. I look at what's gone on is basically overreach versus underperformance. China overreached. China had a pretty good thing going with companies that would work with China on technology and markets being open to China, and then they basically turned to reform and closing, reforming for Chinese companies and closing for foreign companies where they could replace them, and then all these different technology policies that were very much about China decoupling, going way back. On the American side, I think as you were alluding to, David, underperformance. We failed to invest in science and technology education, failed to invest in government R&D. The study I did that Rob talked about was, I think the first 3 decades after World War II, 2/3 of R&D government spending, working with companies and academia, because a lot of this stuff can't be done by venture capital, can't be done by companies, because money is not patient enough. It needs government money. And what we've done as China opened up and so much manufacturing moved there, we went from design, manufacturing, and sales to design and sales, and we did not hold on to our manufacturing. And then, even the Department of Defense did a study of its supply chain a couple of years ago, and such a high percentage of what the Defense Department was buying was coming from China that they kept that number classified on just how large it was. So the U.S. needs to reglobalize, is the way I look at it. China's doing that. They're reglobalizing. They have this new dual circulation policy where they're stepping back and they're looking at the world. They're looking at domestically. They're looking at a long-term hostile environment. And how do they reglobalize? Meaning what they do outside of China and any dependence they have outside of China is to protect themselves and their own market. The U.S. basically needs to do the same, because this is going to be, I think, a period of long-term hostility. I'm happy to see that even the conservative Republicans are starting to turn towards let's compete with China. As Marco Rubio said last year, they got to give up on free market fundamentalism. Since Reagan, it's been free markets solve all problems, cutting back on government funding in so many ways, and of course the Cold War blew planning. Economic planning, because if you did economic planning, you must be a communist. But let's look back a bit. 1791, Alexander Hamilton. He came up with policies on subsidies for encouraged industries, import bans, protective tariffs that lasted 150 years. The War Production Board of World War II, when basically industry and government came together. It was run by a Sears executive. It was the world's largest planned economy at the time. And we emerged from World War II with 50% of global GDP. We can't contain China. China's the leading trading nation for 2/3 of the world's countries. And 90% of future growth is going to come outside of the EU and America. And at least in the next couple of decades, a lot of that's going to come from China. So, I'm kind of tired. I've been in China 30 years. I've been watching China overcome its weaknesses step by step. And I've been watching America dissipate its strengths. China, one thing you got to say about China is they're united and moving ahead, and we're yelling at each other on cable TV. It's there's an own goal there. We got to get our stuff together. And we have to remember that the big multinationals, especially the ones that are doing things China can't do, have very good market share in China. It's they're in China for China, which does make them vulnerable. And I understand this report's idea of right sizing various markets. And I just think that in China for China, you can't block these American companies from doing business in China, because if they're gone, they're going to be replaced by the Koreans and the Japanese and the Europeans, and these American companies like Chips and others are going to lose their global leadership. What I tell companies is, you got to use China to beat China. Okay, be in China, make a lot of money in China, bring it home, and advance your technology and keep your global leadership role, and learn from China. China used America to beat America. Well, we can do the same thing. I guess I'd just like to end on the most recent policies, because I really don't quite know what it's going to turn into. Well, let me go quickly through the repertoire here. The Chinese China's been playing technology catch up with the West since the Qing dynasty. So Mao comes in. He has his 1956 plan put together with the Soviet that ends up with 2 bombs and a satellite: the atom bomb, the hydrogen bomb, and the 1970 East is Red satellite. Deng comes in 78, 20,000 experts, makes science and technology one of the 4 modernizations, and has 100 and some projects put together. Hu and Wen come in 2006 with indigenous innovation, which is about co-innovation, re-innovation, absorbing and assimilating the technology of your foreign partner, and then beating them globally. That didn't go over very big. And so then 2009, they came up with the strategic emerging industries. Let's get into all the industries of the future, where there's not solid ownership by somebody, and beat them. The problem is, a lot of that money went into state labs and state companies, and it became a game of how do you get money out of the government. 2015, Made in China 2025 is a lot more powerful because it's smarter. It involves venture capital. It involves mergers and acquisitions. And there's been a big pushback on that because basically it set up quotas on market share on Chinese companies having X% market share in China for various technologies, ranging from 20 to 80%. People say, well, they'll never be able to reach it. But I've been watching China a long time. When China sets a goal, they may not make it at first, but they'll keep hammering away and come at it in various different angles. So Made in China 2025 became very political under this trade war. So just 2 weeks ago, they've come up with something called New Strategic Emerging Industries. And it's a new plan. It calls for 10 strategic emerging industrial bases, 100 strategic emerging industrial clusters, 1,000 strategic emerging industrial ecosystems. I do not know what that means, but it does show China's ambition. And the investment is 5G, robotics, new energy technology, basically the same repertoire that actually goes back to indigenous innovation. So China's on the move, and they're constantly innovating and trying to move ahead. I think as was said earlier, we got to wake up, grow up, and compete. We got to quit belly aching and compete. With that cheerful note,
No, thank you, Jim. One of the points that you made that we make regularly, and sometimes I feel like it falls on deaf ears, but we need to challenge China in China for that market. And every time we walk away from that, and it's like handing them an aircraft carrier to launch attacks, commercial attacks. Every dollar we take from them in their market means an extra dollar we have, our American companies have, an extra a dollar less, or yuan less than they do. And oftentimes you hear, well, American companies should just pull out. And to your point, if we pull out, either they get the market or our competitors get the market. It's kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. We see that with semiconductors. So I also like your point, overreach and underperformance. That kind of captures it all. Hopefully they'll continue to overreach, and hopefully we'll start to overperform. So Craig, over to you. Oh, and by the way, again, reminder on questions. If you want to ask questions, feel free to jump in. So, and I'll call on people or read the question. So, Craig.
Okay, well, thank you, Rob and David, for a really insightful paper. I really enjoyed it. And thank you, Jim, for always insightful and entertaining comments on the paper. It's difficult to follow Jim McGregor, but I shall try. I hope that this paper is translated into Japanese and to German and Dutch and French, because obviously the problems highlighted in the paper are not bilateral problems. They are multilateral global and regional problems. I think that the insights are great, and that within Brussels or Tokyo or Seoul, there would be many people who feel the same way and who would like to cooperate with the U.S. As we move forward. And I like this paper for many reasons, but I guess the biggest reason, if I could, is that you really frame the issue of scale very well. China's scale, 20% of the world's population and up to half of the world's market in many industries, is really what's driving much of this. And I think that that Stalin had it perfectly right when he said of China, sometimes quantity has a quality all of its own. And that is particularly true in high-tech industries where companies can really produce at scale. And that is a very difficult proposition that we are facing. And so I compliment David and Rob for noting that China is our biggest supplier, China is our toughest competitor, China is our largest market and our largest geopolitical rival. This is a very simple insight, but it's a very important insight. And we have to deal with the tensions that are inherent in this relationship. And I agree with the results of the paper that doing so hand in hand with our European, Japanese, and Korean and other Canadian and Australian colleagues is really the right way to go. So a number of other things I like about the paper very much is that there's a recognition that more industries prefer continuity and seek change. And I think that we're focused here really on tech. But I'm not sure that really the same concerns are as strongly felt in consumer goods, agriculture, manufacturing, or services. And indeed, among the companies of the U.S.-China Business Council, I would say that our consumer goods companies are very happy to be able to supply a middle-class market of 300 million and growing, and indeed put India and China and Southeast Asia together, that we're dealing with over half of the global middle-class market. And that's going to continue to expand. And they want American brands and American products. And so don't talk about, please, decoupling for consumer goods. And agriculture is very similar in many respects. We're shipping a lot of animal protein. The Phase 1 agreement was very successful in opening up many of China's ag markets. American manufacturers, I think, I thank Jim for mentioning, they're in China for the China market. They're not there exporting back to the United States. So David, you mentioned that transparency, that American companies, retailers should be transparent about where they receive their products from. And I have no quarrel with that whatsoever, but I would note that the manufacturers of virtually all of those consumer goods are not American. They are mostly Korean, Hong Kong, and Japanese. There are some American companies there, but our companies are in China because China is the most rapidly growing large market in the world. And we anticipate that China will continue to produce 30% of global growth over the next 10 years. And yes, we want to be a part of that. So I would agree with the paper also that tech is different. And I think Jim articulated it beautifully, that the Chinese have a plan to create innovation at scale. And the scale that China can bring to this innovative endeavor is indeed massive. And it's something that we need to look at very carefully and produce appropriate and effective measures that don't penalize China and hurt ourselves, but hopefully that address some of the problems internally within China to try to make them a better global player, particularly in the tech industries. I would note that the phase one negotiations, particularly the IPR, were very successful there at improving intellectual property right protections in China. There's still a long way to go. And I think that the US government and the 301 has identified the issues very well. And they are cyber, they are subsidies, they are China's tech policies, and state-owned enterprises. But there's a whole subset of many other issues included there, including standards that are very important. Now, I will argue that proceeding to the phase two negotiations is very important. And Jim's right that China has a plan, and that plan could be considered predatory, and that we need to get our act together. Well, part of getting our act together is negotiating seriously with the Chinese on the phase two issues. And I think it's very important that we look at the global trade institutions, be it the WTO, and I would argue also the TPP, as a reference point, as giving us and the Chinese a common vocabulary, as giving us and the Chinese common normative values that we could look at as potential areas that we could congeal around. We have to remember that the WTO was written some 25, 30 years ago by Western countries and Japan, and that it absolutely needs updating. I would argue that the TPP or USMCA does a lot of that heavy lifting. Particularly with regard to cross-border data flows, improved intellectual property right protection, digital, pharma, and a good number of other industries. This has already been accepted largely within the US context by virtue of USMCA. And the Chinese have studied it very carefully, and I would argue that potentially this gives us common grounds for our negotiators to go after. Let us not assume that we are in perpetual conflict with China forever. Rather, let us strive to work with the Chinese to help them to become a better part of the global innovation ecosystem. We want Chinese creativity, we want Chinese STEM talent, we want Chinese innovation as normal and constructive players within the global innovation ecosystem. That will be difficult to achieve, I have to admit, but it is possible. And while we are striving at that, I think that it is critically important that we not forget our own values and our own institutions and our own, what has brought us the success that we have thus far. And I think that that's kind of well encapsulated in a story that Joe Nye of Harvard tells about a conversation that he had with Lee Kuan Yew, the former president of Singapore, and one of the great men of the last century. In a conversation reported in Joe Nye's latest book, Joe asks Lee Kuan Yew, well, in this U.S.-China thing, who's going to win? And Lee Kuan Yew replies, well, of course, America will. Joe Nye was surprised at that and asked Lee Kuan Yew, well, why is that? And Lee Kuan Yew replied, well, China only has 1.4 billion people, 20% of the world's population only. Joe Nye was even more surprised. And he said, well, we only have 4% or 320 million people. How is it that we're going to beat China? And Lee Kuan Yew replied that if the United States plays the American game by American rules and continues with the values that have brought us where we are, the rest of the world will join with America, and the Chinese model will be much less attractive than the American model. But we need to remain true to our model. We need to refurbish that model. It could use a little paint, a little bit of polish, but with that, I have no doubt that we will do very, very well. We're entering into a period of some form of transition to a second Trump administration or to a Biden administration. And I hope that the leaders of the new government will carefully read this paper, because I think it offers very valuable insights. Thank you very much.
Craig, thank you for those comments and the kind words at the end. So we have a bunch of questions and we have 14 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is ask the questions, but maybe unless you have a burning desire, maybe we could just have one person for each question, and maybe we could try to keep them brief. So I guess one question would be, what do we really see as the threat from China? The question here is, what's the real threat, particularly to America? Is it China expanding its soft power? Is it fear of more engagement in cyber? You know, what actually is it? I don't know, Jim, maybe you can take that one.
I think it's the difference in the model is in the development model, and China has a lot of advantages in certain areas now. I mean, if your companies don't have to make money and they have China Development Bank and everybody else backing them, and they're going around the world selling equipment, and they can undercut everybody else by 80%. I mean, Huawei's technology threat is one thing, but its model where it can just undercut everybody else and kill other people in that business because of the subsidies. That's, I think just the whole model going out of China's borders and advantages it can have if we don't protect ourselves. I think that's a big part of the threat.
Yeah, thank you. I just wrote a long piece for the Journal of American Affairs called "Who Lost Lucent," and it went into why we don't have a 5G telecom equipment. And certainly some of it were, as with all of this, some of it was our own mistakes and lack of efforts and things, but some of it was predation from China, unfair practices and the like. And we're seeing that. We just released a report this week on solar and how the Chinese really decimated the U.S. solar industry, panel industry. So yeah, I couldn't agree more that the sort of commercial threat. And David, you really alluded to that there for a bunch of industries now, and it could be even more industries, movies, for example, and the like.
Yeah, and I would just pick up on Craig's point, and one of the central questions to me is, how important is tech in this sphere? And because as Craig said, the consumer goods, agriculture, they see things quite differently. But to me, the reason tech is more important than just tech is that it actually will be the underlying foundation for quite a lot of other industries, defense and banking and the life sciences and entertainment and so many other fields. It is the foundation. So to me, it's not just a question of what Apple needs, and the tech companies needs. It's whether we have the latest technologies as foundations for all of our industries as we move into sort of more automated societies. And that sort of larger tech question, I think, is not often fully recognized.
So I'm not going to go in the order that they're listed, but there's one certainly timely, given Subcommittee Chairman Cicilline's report yesterday on antitrust and the big tech platforms. The question is, please comment on the wisdom of antitrust efforts towards the dominant U.S. tech platforms in light of China's mercantilist support of Tencent, Alibaba, and others. I certainly have my view, but I'll let anybody else go first on that. David?
Oh, I'm happy to. I mean, to me, at this stage in time where the top 10 Chinese tech players are roughly the same, but a little bit smaller than our top 10s, and in many ways a fair fight in terms of capabilities and prospects, the idea of dismantling our leaders at this time and bogging them down in that seems unwise.
Yeah, particularly when you see the history of what we've done there. We didn't destroy Xerox, but we weakened it significantly because of antitrust in the 70s. The Japanese got it. Same thing with RCA in the 50s. That's where the Japanese color television industry came from, was the antitrust case against RCA. IBM, you followed that for years. IBM really bogged down, kind of one hand tied behind its back, and it really had negative consequences for the company. So it's something. Obviously, there's issues around antitrust and enforcement and all that, but concerns. Craig,
some small stuff of having Facebook spin some stuff off, or Amazon treating some of their in-house goods differently. They can do some tinkering around the stuff, but fundamentally breaking them up into, or limiting them, or punishing them, I think is not the way to go. But there are some small things that can be done.
Sure.
Yeah, I would argue that there are legitimate different principles around antitrust. The European model of antitrust, the American model of antitrust are subtly but importantly different. The Chinese model of antitrust, I'm sorry to say, does have an important technology component to it. And they look at this, or they have in the past looked at it as a part of their technology acquisition programs, and they have encouraged or forced companies to transfer technology as part of antitrust investigations or processes, and that's something that we really need to deal with. It's inappropriate to use antitrust as a technology acquisition vehicle, and that should be a part of the phase 2 negotiations going forward.
Yeah, great. So there are a couple of questions I'm going to combine them, and they really relate to allies in the neighborhood. One is about how do we go, building on David's point in the report we did, positive U.S.-India relationships. Another, but just not just India, but Japan, Korea, and some of the other Central and Southeast Asian states. Maybe I'll start with Jim on that. I mean, we had the chance to do TPP. We failed. We could have done a TPP, for example, with a strong currency regime in it. That might have been a compromise, but whatever, we didn't do it. Do you think there's an opportunity there, particularly now with the Chinese trade agreement, RCEP? Should we be going more in that direction? And if so, how?
I think pulling out of TPP was the stupidest thing we've done since invading Iraq. We discredited ourselves in a whole region economically, and we left all these countries at the mercy of China. And think about how many years these countries fought internally to buy into that agreement. Then America says, well, where does that leave us? I think we need to get back into TPP. We need to go on bended knee to those countries and say, look, we're ready to change, because another aircraft carrier in the South China Sea is not going to help these countries economically to have some independence from China and a way to hedge against China. And I think working with India, working with the Quad countries, we need to seriously work with whoever we can economically because everybody's in the same position with China. China does not have soft power; it's only got hard power, and it's exercising with its wolf warrior diplomacy, its transactional arrangements whenever it deals with countries. So we have a chance to get back in and work with these countries, but we better be humble when we do it, and we better do it fast.
Great. So this one, maybe it's an empirical question. Again, I don't know, Jim or Craig, you're probably best positioned. we hear a lot about companies decoupling and pulling stuff out of China. There's certainly a lot of examples of that where companies have either moved things, say, to Vietnam or Malaysia or other places. I saw something recently that said that the number overall was relatively modest. Now, Japan, that may pick up because Abe, before he retired, they did a big incentive package. How do you see that playing out in the next, first of all, what's happened so far? How do you see it playing out in terms of U.S. companies pulling out manufacturing and putting it somewhere else?
I'll be quick and then I'll let Craig follow up. Basically, there's a lot of the people manufacturing for the globe out of China were eating market share for years. I'm saying eating margin for years because China got so expensive. But the supply chains were so good and the workforce was so good and the logistics shipping around the world were so good, they were eating margin. So then the tariffs come along, COVID comes along, that's a straw that a lot of them are moving out, and that's okay. That's a natural process. But again, I'll get back to in China for China. I see a lot of companies doubling down, a lot of American companies in high-end manufacturing and the suppliers to that and technologies, they're doubling down in China.
The word decoupling is such a vague and difficult word. What does it mean? It means tariffs. It means investment controls. It means export controls. It means restricting visas. It means getting rid of pesky journalists. It means a series of prosecutions and administrative procedures and new laws that may or may not be implementable. And what I see is both countries, both governments, willfully decoupling and making it more difficult for companies to be involved. But Rob, at the end of the day, really, this is about the next marginal investment. And I think that in many cases, both American companies are thinking twice about making, in the high-tech area, are thinking twice about making their next marginal investment in China. And Chinese companies are unable to invest in the United States. But I think that that's true really only in tech. In the other areas that I mentioned, as Jim noted, it's full steam ahead. China's going to produce 30% of global growth for the next 10 years, period, full stop, end of story. Our companies need to be there and take advantage of that scale. Tech is different and more complicated, and that's why we're having this conversation.
So maybe we'll go just about 5 minutes over because there's a bunch of other questions. So I think one that to me is a central question, and I know, Jim, I think you alluded to phase two, maybe, or Craig. Question is phase two really possible? Isn't the train way too far down the tracks? CCP data, subsidy standards, security, procurement. In other words, the question really is, aren't these just so baked into the China system that you can't get a phase two? You can't get real serious reform from the Chinese, and then you just sort of stick with what we got. So what are the thoughts there?
Well, Jim and I might have different views on this, but what I would argue is that phase one has worked very well in terms of addressing many of the structural issues that we face. Phase two is not an on or off, black or white, binary, I win, you lose. Not at all. If you look at it like that, then it's impossible. However, if you look at it in terms of making incremental progress on the phase two issues, be it state-owned enterprises, subsidies, cyber, and tech policy, yeah, we can do that. And it is in China's interest that we do that, and it is in America's interest that we do that. And if we do this with our European and our Japanese colleagues, I think that we can absolutely make incremental progress. And we should not give up on that. But we should also not underestimate how difficult it will be. Thank you.
Jim?
I'll just add that phase two, as structured, is basically saying to China, change your system. And I don't think they have any inkling to do that. Having said that, we need discussions. We need dialogues. I was a big critic of the dialogues of the past because they were dialogues to nowhere. The Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade, Strategic and Economic Dialogue. China was very smart. They kept us busy talking here, but over here they did whatever they wanted. Well, now we've woken up to that. We need discussions. We need a dialogue. And if phase 2 is a structure for that, I'm all for talking.
Great. Yeah, as somebody who participated in the innovation dialogue component under the SNED, I can tell you, I always thought about the term of Muhammad Ali, a rope-a-dope. That seemed to be the China strategy. Just keep us talking as they move forward down the road. So maybe one or two last questions. Can the panelists comment on whether USTR Lighthizer should open a bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan now? If so, why? If not, why not? Big issue.
Well, I can talk two ways on this. I was a reporter in Taiwan. I covered the democracy movement. My daughter was born there. I have a real soft spot in my heart for Taiwan and the Taiwanese people, and I think that America has an obligation to work closely with them wherever it can. It could inflame China so much that it's bad for Taiwan. I can't make that judgment, but I'm all for America having a robust and friendly and actually somewhat protective relationship with Taiwan, as China is trying to just eliminate them from any contact with around the world. There are a lot of people that say if that agreement went ahead, it would just really blow things up. I'm not a trade negotiator.
Okay.
So let me add that we are unfortunately viewing things always through a bilateral perspective, and that's not always effective. Taiwan is interested in joining the TPP. I think that that's great. And I think that the U.S. should also join the TPP, effectively giving us a bilateral FTA by means of a regional FTA. And that's what smart diplomacy is all about. You don't go about to get your objective at the highest cost. You go about getting your objective in a manner that is unobjectionable to all other parties. And we need creative diplomacy on this. And with that, we could go a long way without crossing any of China's red lines.
Sure.
Yeah, Rob, on Taiwan, from a tech point of view, Taiwan is the single biggest issue. I would say that we talk a lot about our dependency on China, but we are equally and in some ways even more dependent on Taiwan, particularly in very advanced areas of semiconductor manufacturing and such things. And our competitive position with Taiwan on our side is one thing. Our competitive position, if Taiwan is the next Hong Kong and is just absorbed, is quite another. And so it's considered a vital issue in the future of the tech sector, and all kinds of efforts to get Taiwanese companies to set up shop in America and diversify along those lines.
David,
Yeah,
I would
go
agree
ahead.
with you that the tech is important. The geostrategic side is more important. And we must remember how sensitive this is, and that it's an area where the U.S. and China could come to blows. It is one of the most dangerous geopolitical issues we have out there, and we should treat it with enormous sensitivity and care.
But if we have a trading relationship with Taiwan, why can't we have a trade agreement with Taiwan? It is a separate entity. China says it's under China. That's fine, but why can't we have a separate agreement with them? We trade with them.
To Craig's point, I guess maybe Craig, that would be a way to square the circle. If we join TPP and we said we want Taiwan to join, we address David's concern to some extent, and then we also address Craig's point about not making this a main Cuba powder keg back in the early 1900s, which we can't have.
Taiwan should not be the primary U.S.-China issue. And if it becomes the centerpiece of the relationship, we're going to pay a high price.
So I want to thank you. I want to wrap up. We have a bunch more questions which we could go into, but I do want to be respectful of people's time. So I would want to make one last point, and then maybe let David wrap it up. And the point being, David, you talk about these four potentially conflicting interests. Where you stand depends upon where you sit. And it seems to me that if we had a robust national competitiveness strategy, to sort of go to Jim's point about stopping our, serious underperformance, and whether that's the CHIPS Act to get companies like TSMC or SK or other companies to invest in America, or whether it's the Endless Frontier Act that Schumer and Senator Young have, or a whole set of things people have talked about and we've been proposing. It would seem like that's I don't want to say it's easy to do, but at least you should be able to get political consensus from all the four groups, if you will.
Yeah, and certainly from the political side, I agree with you. But I would just put it from the work that I do, which is mostly not on that side. It's with actual companies, and to take that four-part model, take these challenges to them, and we ask them the question all the time: well, what policies do you actually want? Do you want a national strategy in your industry? Do you want national technology strategy? Do you want confrontation policies, or in this, that, or the other area? And to me, and I'm sure Craig's group does a lot of this, but that voice of, not just what the politicians want, but what the actual players want in there is sort of the part that I'm focused on, and those are sort of clients we work with.
Yeah, I mean, I just would say I think that industry has been, not everybody in industry, I think a lot of tech companies have been forward looking at, but I think too many people in industry have been short-sighted on that, just wanting to pursue what they're doing, which makes sense. But now the chickens have come home to roost, and now there's a lot more turbulence. There's a lot more opposition to those business models. And I think if business had been more of a full-throated supporter of a national technology or competitiveness strategy, I think it would have made it easier in terms of the politics of all this. So I hope industry from a whole lot of different sectors realizes that and says, yeah, we can support these kinds of things.
Yeah, and just to me, it's not just tech, but what does the banking industry want? What does the pharmaceutical industry want? Having a clear sense of how they see their future, it seems to me sort of a missing piece in the dialogue.
Yeah, so absolutely. Although one of the things would be nice, even if the financial sector, to use that as an example, doesn't really want a lot, maybe they do, maybe they don't. If I were them, I would want to have the U.S. be the leader in fintech, for example.
That's what they want.
Yeah, hopefully that's what they want. But hopefully they would ask for more than that. Hopefully they say, yeah, it doesn't really matter to us directly, but we want a strong American technology economy, and we're willing to put a little bit of political capital behind lobbying for the Competes Act, or the CHIPS Act, or the Endless Frontier Act, or the other bill, the new Schumer-Menendez bill, for example. So hopefully we'll see that. Yeah. Great. So with that, I apologize to the audience for not getting to all the questions. There were a lot of really good questions that we didn't get to. I'm sorry about that. But I want to thank everybody for joining us. And I particularly want to thank Craig and Jim and David for joining us today. And we look forward to continuing conversation. So hope everybody has a good rest of the day. Thank you.